Canada, but also around the world. I heard Australia mentioned here earlier. We have Australian members, for example. We do have Dutch members. We do have members from throughout Europe and Asia. And even a couple of African members these days as well. So a new group of members for us has been South America, and it started much the way you're starting in your discussions with us, working with something called ANTP in Brazil and Alamos, which works with metro systems throughout the Latin American area. So again, your idea of reaching out to others is certainly what we found to be true. Now, our offices are located in Washington, D.C. There we have about 90 staff members that try their best to serve the 1,500 organizational members that are APTA. In Washington, obviously, to participate in the public debates that occur around public policy issues. We are, or at least fancy ourselves as the voice of public transportation when it comes to public policy issues in this regard. Our members look for a lot of information from us, and so we're also the organization that guards over the statistics of the industry, that issues research reports on the industry, that, as Matt has told you, maintains a lot of different ways to reach that, including several different websites. Probably the principal one that you might want to look at is www.apta.com. Now, I need you to go to .com, not .org. You go to .org, you get the American Physical Therapy Association. Now, you might feel better about that, but you're not going to learn anything about public transit there. So .com will get you to just the right place. We're also a standards development organization for our industry. There are many issues that are well covered by other people who set standards. For example, an awful lot of the vehicle standards are set through motor carriers and things like that. So we don't seek to duplicate when somebody else is setting standards, but there are some times that nobody else is setting them, and we feel as an industry they are needed. So, for example, we began this effort about 15 years ago by setting standards on safety standards for passenger rail coaches. The FRA wasn't doing it, the AAR wasn't doing it, and yet increasingly our members wanted work done in that area. Today, a lot of our standards work is really best practices work and how to do things. We don't set the standards for brakes, but we have standards and best practice ideas and recommendations as to how best to maintain those brakes, just to give you a little example. We do an awful lot of work in safety and security. There's that old Hackney phrase about safety. Did I say Hackney in front of a cabbie? Boy, I can't believe that. But anyhow, there's that old phrase that says, safety is our number one priority. And certainly in our hearts and in our minds, it is our number one priority. But it also has to fit up there with 100 other number one priorities that it takes to get the service out every day. So helping our members improve their safety record. Unfortunately, as you may know, public transportation has been the principal target of terrorists around the world for more than 50 years. Now, yesterday was the 10th anniversary of 9/11 and the horrible tragedy of that, but long before 9/11 ever occurred, our industry was dealing with security issues. You need only think about buses blowing up in the Middle East, or attacks in London, or Mumbai, or sarin attacks in the 90s in the Japanese subways to know why security has been an important issue to us for a long time. And certainly yesterday, as we all reflected on those horrible events and what they meant to our way of life and our country, we were part of those national and indeed international ceremonies honoring the fallen and the victims of that particular day. We also are very much involved in innovations. Many people have great ideas that they think is going to revolutionize public transit. Well, while we're not a Consumer Reports or House of Good Keeping magazine like the Good, what am I trying to say? Good Housekeeping seal of approval. I told you it's been that kind of day. Any moment I'm going to fall right off here, but somebody will scoop me up and we'll go on from there. Where was I going with that? Oh, innovation we were talking about, yes. And so encouraging our members to understand innovation, to understand new products, to help them figure out what's the best kind of technologies to be using and going forward is something that, they really look to us for. That's led us into a lot of work in various forms of research. I mentioned a joint partnership among the Federal Transit Administration, the Transportation Research Board, and ourselves to put together something that is known as the Transit Cooperative Research. The Transit Cooperative Research Program, TCRP, is a program funded by the U.S. federal government. It's been in recent years $9 or $10 million a year, and it is money that is to be used on very practical, everyday problems. This is not money to be used on pie-in-the-sky stuff that maybe someday will result in the invention of the internet or Teflon or peanut butter or something. This is real practical stuff. How can you improve your service better? How could we do a better job with securing wheelchair devices? What ought to be the best procedures in certain areas, things of that sort. So those are kind of the areas that we work in. Matt is quite right. With a membership the size we have, we do meet quite often. We meet we have probably about 20 different meetings a year. We have an annual meeting which moves around the U.S. and Canada, usually draws 2,000 to 3,000 people a year. Every third year, we have the world's largest public transportation exhibition. That's what's going to be in New Orleans at the end of this month, where we'll draw 16,000, 17,000 people and probably have products from 800 vendors or so. Basically, if it's something to do with public transit and you can't find it there, it probably doesn't exist in that. We also have a conference that focuses specifically on bus and paratransit. And some of you may be interested in that. It's usually in May, and again, it moves around the U.S. and Canada. We have a conference specifically on rail. That's usually in June, and that too moves around North America. In March, we have an annual legislative conference to do exactly for us what Matt says you need to do for you, which is to get to Washington, to sit down, to look them right in the eye and tell them your perspective on what it is that needs to be done. So those are our big conferences. We do hold probably about 15 or 16 other kinds of workshops throughout the year on usually very specific issues, a risk management workshop, an intermodal planning workshop, a bus maintenance workshop, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so we find that even in this age of the internet, even in this time when travel budgets are much tighter than they used to be, people still want to get together, look each other in the eye, have a drink with one another, go to sessions together, see equipment, kick the tires, the whole deal, and therefore we do those things. So that's maybe more than you wanted to know about APTA, but well, Matt told me to tell you, so that's who we are a little bit about that. Well, Matt made reference to the economic times, and I have already as well. Certainly the Great Recession, or I guess for many of us the Great Depression of the last few years, has really taken its toll on our industry. Each of the last 3 years we have been surveying our members to learn how many of, who's in trouble economically. Since misery loves company, what those studies are continuing to show us now for 3 years is that more than 80% of the industry has declining or at best level, but mostly declining revenue over the last 3 years. More than 80% of the industry has raised fares, cut service, taken administrative economies, laid off staff, postponed capital purchases, used up whatever reserves, if any, they might have had, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, as a way of filling those holes. And what our survey is showing this year is that most of our transit system members have had the privilege of doing those things not once, but twice in the last 3 years. And several of our members have had to do it 3 and even 4 times. So it's not happy times, to be sure. Our business members, very similar pattern. Some 74% of our private sector businesses who serve public transit say that their revenues have been flat or declining over the past year. Of those reporting such declines, the average decline was 25%. And so it's really been quite bad. One can only wonder how much worse it would have been but for the stimulus package that was approved, because some $8 billion was made available for public transportation as part of the stimulus, and I can only imagine how much worse it would have been had that not been there. So despite what you may hear from certain politicians, when it comes to public transit, that did have a very positive effect and did help us out. Well, what are our customers wanting and saying these days? We are seeing that public transit is in, despite the economy, still not in terrible shape when it comes to measuring ridership. Let me give you some historical perspective here. The peak ridership for public transportation, not surprisingly, during and right after World War II. By then, almost 23 or about 23 billion times a year, Americans would board public transit. By 1973, that had fallen to 6 billion rides in that particular year. Since 1973, we've been growing, slip back when there's a recession, growing, slip back when there's a recession, growing, so that this year, with any luck at all, we'll be back to our modern high, which was about 10.8 billion rides. Now, that, if you look at it another way, how does that compare with what's going on with population? How does it compare with highways? Well, if you start about 15 years ago and you look in the mid-90s and you come forward, population of the country grew by about 15%. The use of our nation's highways grew by about 21%. The use of public transit grew by about 31%. Now, I know you're so excited, and I've just given you all those great statistics, but I think there's something interesting there, a shift that is going on over the long term towards more interest and more willingness to use collective forms of public transportation. This year so far, we have 2 quarters under our belt since the first of the year, and we are up about 1.6%. So despite the decline in revenues that our systems are seeing, despite the higher fares, despite less service being on the street, we are still seeing our ridership grow. What that says to me is that Americans do want transit, if you think, so we need to find ways to provide that kind of service, and we need to do it more economically. Hence, another opportunity for our paths to cross as we go forward here. By the way, for my Canadian friends, the statistics here in Canada are much stronger, and your public transit is up almost 4% right now. I understand later this week you may be hearing from my equivalent at the Canadian Urban Transit Association, Michael Rochlau, and I'm sure he'll be able to tell you much more about that. Well, let's talk a little bit about the ways in which taxi and paratransit has cooperated with public transit, and maybe that'll give us some clues as to what more we might do. Matt told you that you don't have great statistics to find. There's not lots of statistical data on what's going on in the taxi industry that is easily looked at on a national basis. But one way I chose to look at it was to look into something called the National Transit Database, which defines, which is the statistical reporting that public transit has to do. And we looked in there to see how many taxi cab contracts and paratransit contracts are reported. We found that over 130 different contracts of service around the U.S. between transit operators and taxi and paratransit companies are what gets reported to the federal government. Now, I'll tell you, as a guy who's worked with that database and fact, helped invent it back in the 70s. There's an awful lot of stuff that never gets reported there.